The crystal chandeliers of Seoul's most exclusive gala didn't just illuminate the room. They reflected a power shift that no one saw coming. In a hall filled with the most dangerous men in South Korea, the air suddenly turned to ice. Every conversation died mid-sentence. Every head turned toward the massive mahogany doors. A woman stepped inside, and for a moment, time itself seemed to fracture. She wasn't just beautiful. She was regal, draped in a breathtaking fusion of vibrant, royal West African silk and the sharp, structured lines of Korean high fashion. Her gaze was steady, a sharp contrast to the trembling girl everyone remembered. At the center of the room stood Kang Dae, the undisputed shadow king of the Seoul underworld, a man who had built an empire on fear and the humiliation of those he deemed lesser. His glass slipped from his hand, shattering against the marble floor, but he didn't even notice. He was staring at the woman he had once forced to scrub his floors. The girl he had mocked for her accent, the useless foreigner he had broken for sport. She walked straight through the sea of billionaires, her heels clicking with the rhythmic precision of a death march, stopping only inches from his face. A smirk, cold and knowing, played on her lips as she leaned in, her voice a calm, melodic blade. "You should have looked closer, Kang Dae," she whispered. "Because while you were watching the floor I cleaned, I was busy dismantling your world." Before we dive into how a broken Maid became the queen of the underworld, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story of ultimate justice. You won't want to miss the moment she reveals the one secret Kang Dae would have killed to keep hidden. Now, let's go back to where the nightmare began. 3 months earlier, the atmosphere in the Kang Dae estate was thick with a different kind of tension. It was a place of gold-plated silence, where the only sound was the soft shuffle of Zara's feet as she moved through the sprawling mansion. To the world, Zara was a ghost. To Kang Dae, she was an ornament of servitude. She had arrived in Seoul with nothing but a heavy suitcase and a heavier silence, taking the job as a live-in maid for a man whose name was whispered in back alleys with terror. She spoke broken, stuttering Korean, her eyes always glued to the floor, her shoulders hunched as if trying to shrink out of existence. Kang Dae loved it. He thrived on the sight of her trembling. He would often host lavish, cruel dinners where the main course wasn't the food, but the degradation of his staff. "Look at her," Kang Dae would sneer, pointing a gold ring at Zara as she poured wine with shaking hands. "She comes from a place of dust and heat, thinking she can find a life in my city. She can't even understand the language of the people she serves. She is invisible, and that is all she will ever be." The guests would roar with laughter, tossing crumbs at her feet, watching as she knelt to pick them up without a single word of protest. But Zara was far from invisible. Beneath the mask of the shy, terrified maid, her mind was a steel trap, snapping shut on every piece of information that drifted through the cigar smoke of the mahogany office. While Kang Dae treated her like a piece of furniture, he spoke freely about shipment routes, bank codes, and the politicians he had in his pocket. He never noticed that her broken Korean seemed to improve only when she was alone, or how her eyes, usually clouded with faux confusion, would sharpen into diamonds the second his back was turned. One rainy Tuesday, a high-ranking official from the Ministry of Trade visited. He was nervous, sweating through his expensive suit. "The African investment bloc is tightening the noose," the official warned, his voice hushed. "If we don't secure the port deals by next month, the entire network collapses." Kang Dae laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Don't worry about the foreigners. They're slow. They're predictable. Just like this one," he said, reaching out to roughly grab Zara's arm as she walked past with a tray. He squeezed until her skin bruised, forcing her to look him in the eye. "Tell me, Zara, does your family back home even know what $1,000,000,000 looks like? Or are they still trading in salt?" Zara didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She simply lowered her head, her voice a tiny, pathetic whimper. I sorry, master. I not understand." Kang Dae shoved her away in disgust, unaware that in that very moment, Zara had just memorized the account number scribbled on the document resting on his desk. She was a shadow in a house of light, a predator disguised as prey. Every insult he hurled at her was a debt she recorded in her mind, a debt that was accruing massive interest. The humiliation reached its boiling point during the Night of the Red Moon, a celebration for a successful smuggling operation. The house was packed with the elite, and Kang Dae was drunk on power. He called Zara to the center of the ballroom, the music stopping as all eyes fell on the dark-skinned girl in her stained apron. "Our guest from the West says she has a song from her people," Kang Dae announced, his voice dripping with malice. "Dance for us, Zara. Show us the culture you're so proud of." The room was silent, the air heavy with the scent of expensive perfume and cheap cruelty. Zara stood frozen. She didn't dance. She didn't move. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable. "Dance," Kang Dae roared, stepping forward and splashing a glass of dark red wine across her white apron. The liquid soaked through, looking like a fresh wound against her chest. The guests began to jeer, calling her names that bit like vipers. Zara looked up, and for the first time, her eyes weren't on the floor. She looked directly at Kang Dae. There was no fear there anymore. There was only a cold, terrifying emptiness. It was the look of a person who had already finished the game while the opponent was still setting up the board. Without a word, she turned and walked out of the room. Kang Dae screamed after her, threatening to have her blacklisted, to have her deported, to make sure she rotted in a cell. He thought he was watching a broken woman retreat. He didn't realize he was watching the fuse being lit on his own empire. That night, the mansion felt different. The air was too still. When the sun rose over the Seoul skyline, the maid's quarters were empty. Zara was gone. She hadn't taken her clothes. She hadn't taken her meager paycheck. The only thing missing was the sense of security Kang Dae had spent 20 years building. He laughed it off at breakfast, telling his associates that the trash had finally taken itself out. But as the days turned into weeks, a strange sickness began to infect his business. It started with a missed shipment. Then, a bank in Switzerland froze an account that didn't exist. Suddenly, the powerful men who used to bow to Kang Dae weren't returning his calls. There was a new player in the city, a mysterious entity known only as the Phoenix Group. They were outbidding him on every contract, buying up his debts, and whispering into the ears of his most loyal allies. Kang Dae was losing his grip, and he had no idea that the hand pulling the strings was the same hand he had forced to scrub his toilets. The escalation was beginning, and the fall would be long, dark, and utterly silent. The silence Zara left behind wasn't empty. It was a vacuum that began sucking the air out of Kang Dae's lungs. Within 2 weeks, the King of Seoul was looking more like a man drowning in a suit he could no longer afford. He paced his office, the floorboards creaking under the weight of his paranoia. His phone, once a lifeline of power, had become a harbinger of doom. "Sir, the Busan shipment was seized," his frantic assistant stammered, his eyes darting to the floor. "And the international investors, they've pulled out of the Smart City project. They say they've found a more stable partner." Kang Dae roared, sweeping a crystal vase off his desk. The shattering glass sounded hauntingly like the night he had humiliated Zara. Who is this partner?" he screamed. But the only answer was the cold dial tone of a disconnected world. He didn't realize that every time he had mocked Zara's broken Korean, she was actually mentally translating his ledgers. Every time he called her stupid, she was memorizing the offshore routing numbers he shouted over his shoulder. If you're gripping your seat wondering how deep this betrayal goes, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe right now, because what she does next is a masterclass in psychological warfare. Trust me, the revenge is just getting started. The pressure intensified until the very walls of the mansion seemed to close in. Kang Dae's most loyal enforcers were being approached by a mysterious intermediary offering triple their salary to simply walk away. The city's underground was whispering about a woman, a shadow, who knew every secret, every bribe, and every shallow grave Kang Dae had ever dug. He tried to find her. He sent men to the immigration offices, to the small African community hubs in Itaewon, to the slums. Nothing. It was as if Zara had never existed. But the Phoenix Group was very real. They didn't just compete, they dismantled. They leaked a recording of a high-ranking senator taking a bribe in Kang Dae's private study. A recording taken from a vantage point that could only have been the corner where a maid stood silently with a tray of tea. Kang Dae felt the noose tightening. His bank accounts were being drained by ghost transactions, and the legal teams he paid millions were suddenly unavailable. The psychological toll was even worse than the financial ruin. Kang Dae began to see her everywhere. In the reflection of a window, in the peripheral vision of a crowded street, a flash of dark skin, a hint of a colorful head wrap. He stopped sleeping. He started drinking, the very wine she used to pour for him now tasting like ash. He was haunted by her last look, that void of fear, that terrifying stillness. He realized, too late, that he hadn't been mistreating a servant. He had been poking a sleeping lioness while trapped in her cage. The escalation reached a fever pitch when a formal invitation arrived at his door, hand-delivered by a man in a military-grade black SUV. It was an invitation to the Centennial Gala at the Latte World Tower, the most prestigious event of the decade. But it wasn't just an invite. Taped to the back was a small, dried flower, a protea, the national flower of South Africa. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. Was she there? Was this a trap or a final confrontation? He had to go. He had to look his enemy in the eye, even if that enemy was the girl he once forced to clean his shoes with her bare hands. He spent his last remaining liquid assets on a suit that felt like armor, but as he stepped into his limousine, he noticed something chilled him to the bone. The driver was new, a man he didn't recognize. "Where is Minho?" Kangdae asked, his voice trembling. The driver didn't turn around. He simply pulled out into the neon-lit streets of Seoul and said, "He found a better employer, sir. One who pays in respect, not just blood money." The car sped toward the tower, and for the first time in his life, the Mafia boss felt like a prisoner being transported to his execution. The Latte World Tower glowed like a needle piercing the sky. As Kangdae stepped out, the flashes of paparazzi cameras felt like gunfire. He pushed through the crowd, his ego desperately trying to reassert itself. He was still Kangdae. He was still a god in this city. But as he entered the grand ballroom, the reality hit him like a physical blow. Men who used to beg for his time now turned their backs. Women who fluttered around him now whispered behind their fans, their eyes filled with pity. He was a pariah. And then, the music changed. A deep, rhythmic drumbeat began to pulse through the high-tech speakers, a sound that didn't belong in a sterile Korean ballroom. It was ancient, powerful, and demanding. The massive double doors at the head of the hall began to swing open. This is the moment of no return. The air in the room vanished. The billionaires, the generals, the kings of industry, they all moved aside, creating a path like the parting of the Red Sea. And there she was. But the girl in the stained apron was dead. In her place stood a queen. She wore a gown that was a masterpiece of storytelling. Deep emerald green silk embroidered with gold threads that traced the map of a continent. Her hair was styled in an intricate, royal crown of braids, adorned with diamonds that caught the light and threw it back like daggers. Her skin glowed with a confidence that made the Seoul elite look pale and fragile. She wasn't walking. She was reclaiming. Beside her walked the very investors Kangdae had lost, treating her not as a partner, but as a sovereign. Kangdae stood frozen in the middle of the floor, a broken glass once again at his feet. His mind raced. How? Why? He wanted to scream, to call her a fraud, to demand she be thrown out. But his throat was dry. She stopped 5 feet from him. The silence was so heavy it felt like it might collapse the ceiling. She didn't look at him with anger. She looked at him with the same bored indifference he had once shown her. It was the ultimate insult. She leaned toward him, the scent of expensive oud and African spices filling his senses. "Do you remember the wine you spilled on me, Kangdae?" she asked, her Korean now flawless, elegant, and chillingly sharp. "I kept the dress, not as a memory of my shame, but as a receipt for yours." The room gasped. The invisible Maid had just declared war in front of the entire world. The silence that followed her words wasn't just quiet. It was heavy, like the pressure at the bottom of the ocean. Kangdae felt the eyes of every titan of industry and soul boring into his back, watching the king wither under the gaze of a woman he had once treated as less than human. He tried to speak, to summon that old, terrifying roar that used to make men tremble, but all that came out was a dry, pathetic wheeze. Zara didn't wait for his response. She turned her back on him, the ultimate sign of disrespect, and began to glide toward the center stage, where the microphone stood waiting. Every step she took seemed to echo with the phantom sound of the scrubbing brush she had once wielded in his halls. The investors he had spent a decade courting didn't even glance at him. They trailed after her like loyal subjects. The shift in power was so sudden, so violent, that it felt like the very foundation of the Latte World Tower was tilting. If your heart is racing as fast as Kangdae's right now, you need to hit that subscribe button and smash the like. We are seconds away from the revelation that will leave you breathless. The truth about who Zara really is and why she chose Kangdae as her target. Don't blink, because the next 60 seconds change everything. As Zara reached the podium, she didn't look at the crowd. She looked at the city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. 10 years ago, she began, her voice amplified and echoing with a chilling authority. A South Korean firm arrived in Lagos with promises of prosperity. They took our land, they took our resources, and when my father resisted their corruption, they took his life. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Kangdae's face went from pale to a ghostly, translucent gray. He remembered that deal. He remembered this stubborn man in Nigeria who wouldn't take the bribe. He remembered the accident he had ordered from thousands of miles away. I didn't come to Seoul to find a job, Zara continued, her eyes finally snapping to Kangdae, pinning him like a specimen to a board. I came to find the man who signed the order. I wanted to see the face of the monster who thought he could erase a legacy by hiding behind a maid's apron. The escalation of the scandal was instantaneous. On the massive digital screens surrounding the ballroom, documents began to scroll, bank transfers, encrypted emails, and photos of the very men in this room shaking hands with criminals. It was a digital execution. Zara had used her time as a silent, made to bug every corner of Kangdae's life. She hadn't just been cleaning his floors. She had been digging his grave with a silver spoon. You called me invisible, she said, stepping down from the stage and walking toward him again, the crowd parting like she was a goddess of war. But being invisible is a superpower. I saw the greed you hid in your safe. I heard the murders you whispered over your scotch. And I took every single one of them. Kangdae's knees finally buckled. He fell to the marble, the same way Zara had fallen when he tripped her for sport months ago. The irony was a physical weight, crushing the air out of his lungs. He looked up at her, begging with his eyes, but he found no mercy in those dark, brilliant depths. Please, he croaked, the words sounding foreign in his own mouth. Zara knelt down, her expensive silk gown pooling around her like a halo of emerald fire. She leaned in close, her voice a whisper meant only for him. My father's name was Adebayo. You should have learned how to say it. Because tonight, it's the name that's going to be written on the deed to everything you own. The room erupted into chaos. Security teams, once loyal to the Mafia, began to move, but they weren't moving to protect Kangdae. They were moving to escort him out. The investors were already lining up to shake Zara's hand, desperate to stay on the right side of the new sun rising over the city. The humiliation was absolute. The man who ruled through fear was now being hauled away like common trash, while the maid he mocked stood as the most powerful person in the room. But the biggest twist was yet to come. As the police, real police, not the ones in Kangdae's pocket, entered the hall, Zara didn't just hand over the evidence. She did something that proved she wasn't just seeking revenge. She was seeking a total takeover. She looked at the lead investigator and handed him a single, gold-encrypted drive. The names of every politician on his payroll are there, she said calmly, including the ones in this room. The panic that hit the gala was like a bomb going off. The elite began to scramble for the exits, but the doors were already locked. Zara had trapped the entire corrupt ecosystem of the city in one room. She stood in the center of the storm, calm and unbothered, a queen who had burned down the world just to build a better one on its ashes. Kangdae looked back one last time as he was being led away in handcuffs, seeing the girl he had called useless, holding the fate of the entire country in her palm. He had spent his life looking down on the world, never realizing that the person at his feet was the one who would eventually bring him to his knees. The story of the shy maid was over. The reign of the empress had begun. The fall of the house of Kangdae wasn't a slow burn. It was a total eclipse. As the police led him through the gauntlet of his former peers, the man who once commanded legions looked like a hollow shell of a human being. He stumbled over the very same marble floor he had once forced Zara to polish with her own clothes. Every flash of a camera was a nail in his coffin, and every whisper from the crowd was a ghost of an insult he had once hurled at a girl who was simply playing a part. Zara stood at the top of the grand staircase, her silhouette framed by the shimmering lights of Seoul, looking down at the wreckage of an empire. She didn't look triumphant. She looked settled. The debt had been paid in full, and the interest had cost Kangdae his soul. The invisible girl had become the only thing anyone could see, a vibrant, powerful reminder that the people society ignores are often the ones holding the matches. This is the final moment of justice we've all been waiting for. But the ending holds one last secret that will change how you see this entire story. Before we reveal the final fate of the King of Seoul, make sure to subscribe and hit that like button to join our community of storytellers. Your support helps us bring more of these incredible tales of justice to life. Now, let's see the final move in this high-stakes game. As the doors of the police transport slammed shut, echoing like a gavel in the night air, the gala hall remained in a state of suspended animation. The politicians and titans of industry who hadn't been arrested stood frozen, waiting for Zara's next move. They expected a speech, a threat, or perhaps a demand for loyalty. Instead, Zara did something that proved she was nothing like the man she had replaced. She signaled to her assistants, and within seconds, the massive digital screens shifted from bank records to a series of blueprints. This city was built on the backs of people you never bothered to learn the names of, she said, her voice echoing with a regal, unwavering calm. The Kangdae Foundation is now the Adebayo Legacy Fund. From tomorrow, his properties will be converted into housing, schools, and legal clinics for the migrant workers he exploited for decades. The room was silent. This wasn't just a change in leadership, it was a revolution. Zara wasn't just taking his money. She was erasing his name from history and replacing it with the name of the man he had murdered. She walked back down the stairs, her emerald dress trailing behind her like a river of hope. As she reached the exit, she stopped next to the head of the waitstaff, an elderly man who had watched her endure months of Kangdae's cruelty in silence. She reached out and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "No more kneeling," she whispered in perfect, soulful Korean. The old man's eyes filled with tears as he bowed, not out of fear, but out of a deep, profound respect. Zara stepped out into the cool Seoul night, the neon lights reflecting in her eyes, finally breathing the air of a woman who was truly free. Kangdae spent his first night in a cold, concrete cell, the silence of the prison a haunting contrast to the luxury he had stolen. He sat on the floor, the very position he had forced Zara into 1,000 times. He realized then that he hadn't lost because of a business deal or a lucky break. He had lost because he was too arrogant to see the humanity in the person right in front of him. He had looked at a queen and saw a maid. He had looked at a genius and saw a useless foreigner. As the sun began to rise over a city that had already forgotten his name, he realized that Zara's revenge wasn't the prison cell. It was the fact that she had transformed his life's work into a monument for her father. He was gone, but her family's name would live forever. The story of the shy maid and the Mafia boss became a legend in the back alleys and boardrooms of Seoul. It served as a chilling reminder to the powerful: never mistake silence for weakness, and never mistake a lack of words for a lack of a plan. Zara didn't just win. She redefined what power looked like in a world that tries to keep people in the shadows. She proved that the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one screaming for attention, but the one quietly observing, waiting for the perfect moment to take it all. If you found this story of justice and transformation as gripping as we did, don't forget to subscribe, turn on your notification bell, and like the video. What was your favorite moment of Zara's revenge? Share your thoughts in the comments section below. We love hearing your perspective. And if you know someone who loves a story where the underdog comes out on top, share this video with them right now. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.